What if that phone call you've been dreading to make could change everything? What if 7 days was all it took to rebuild what seemed irreparably broken? What if the love that once felt dead was only sleeping, waiting for the right touch to awaken it again? Tonight, we drift into a story of second chances, where broken hearts learn to beat as one again, and where sometimes losing everything is the first step toward finding what really matters. It began on a Monday morning that tasted like regret and instant coffee, when you sat at your kitchen table surrounded by the quiet echoes of a home that had once been filled with laughter and shared dreams but now felt hollow as an empty shell, its rooms holding memories that played like old movies when you weren't careful to keep your thoughts occupied with work or television or anything that might distract you from the ache of what you had lost. The divorce papers lay scattered across the wooden surface that you and Sarah had picked out together during those early years when furniture shopping felt like planning a future rather than dividing assets. Each document stamped with official seals that transformed 23 years of marriage into legal terminology and financial arrangements that reduced love to custody schedules and property division. 6 months had passed since she moved out, taking half the furniture and all the warmth that had made this house feel like home, rather than just a building where you happened to sleep and eat and watch television alone in rooms that seemed too large for one person, but had somehow felt cozy when two hearts had been beating under the same roof. The silence was the hardest part, not just the absence of her voice, calling from the kitchen or humming while she folded laundry, but the deeper silence where conversations used to flow like music, where laughter used to punctuate ordinary moments and turn mundane activities into shared joy. The lawyer had been clear about the timeline. 7 more days before the final hearing. 7 more days before what had been broken beyond repair would be officially declared dead and buried under legal language that would make it impossible to resurrect even if some miracle occurred that could heal the wounds that had accumulated over years of gradual drift and misunderstanding and the slow erosion of intimacy that happens when two people forget how to see each other clearly through the fog of routine and responsibility and the accumulated weight of small disappointments that somehow grow into insurmountable barriers. But on this particular Monday morning, something different stirred in your chest as you stared at those papers, not the familiar cocktail of anger and sadness and resignation that had sustained you through the past months of legal proceedings and awkward conversations about who would keep which wedding gifts, but something that felt dangerously close to hope. Perhaps it was the quality of light streaming through the window that reminded you of the morning you and Sarah had first walked through this house as potential buyers, seeing past its flaws to imagine the life you might build within its walls. Perhaps it was the way your coffee cup sat next to the empty space where hers used to rest, creating a visual reminder of partnership rather than just absence. Or perhaps it was simply that your heart, despite all evidence to the contrary, despite all the reasonable arguments your mind could marshal about incompatibility and irreconcilable differences, and the practical impossibility of rebuilding trust that had been shattered by betrayals both large and small, refused to accept that 23 years of shared history could end with signatures on legal documents and the division of household objects that had once been symbols of unity but had become nothing more than items to be allocated between two separate futures. Monday afternoon arrived with the weight of decision pressing against your chest like a physical force. When you had spent hours staring at your phone and rehearsing conversations that started with apologies and ended with desperate pleas. When you had written and deleted text messages that tried to capture 23 years of regret and longing in character limits that seemed inadequate for saying hello, let alone explaining why you suddenly believed that 7 days might be enough time to heal wounds that had been festering for years. The rational part of your mind cataloged all the reasons why calling Sarah was a mistake. The restraining emotional distance she had maintained since the separation, the practical arrangements she had already made for her new apartment, the way she had looked at you during mediation sessions with eyes that seemed to see a stranger rather than the person she had once promised to love until death parted you. But sometime around 3 o'clock, when the autumn light was slanting through the windows, at the same angle it had 24 years ago, when you first brought her to this house as your girlfriend, and she had stood in the living room, spinning slowly with her arms outstretched, laughing as she declared that she could see your children playing here someday. You found yourself dialing her number before your rational mind could intervene with more sensible alternatives, like accepting reality and moving forward with your separate lives. The phone rang 3 times before her voice answered with the careful neutrality she had perfected during months of necessary but painful communications about logistics and legal requirements. But underneath that protective distance, you could hear something that might have been surprise or curiosity, or perhaps just the reflexive warmth that had once been as natural as breathing when your names appeared on each other's phones. "I know this might sound crazy," you began, the words tumbling out before courage could abandon you. "But what if we gave ourselves 7 days? Not to fix everything, not to pretend the problems don't exist, but just to remember why we fell in love in the first place, before we make this final." The silence that followed felt like holding your breath underwater, waiting to discover whether you would surface into air or drown in the depths of rejection, and the confirmation that some things, once broken, could never be repaired, regardless of how desperately you might wish otherwise. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a quality you hadn't heard in years, not the careful politeness of estranged spouses managing practical arrangements, not the defensive anger that had characterized so many of your recent interactions, but something softer, more vulnerable, tinged with what might have been the same desperate hope that had prompted your impossible request. 7 days, she repeated, as if testing the words for their weight and meaning, as if trying to calculate whether such a brief span could contain enough possibility to justify the risk of reopening wounds that had finally stopped bleeding. What would that look like? What would we do with 7 days that we couldn't do with all the time we've already had? The question hung between you like a bridge you could either cross together or watch collapse under the weight of too much history and accumulated pain. And in that moment, you realized that you didn't have an answer, only a faith that sometimes time wasn't about duration, but about attention, about intention, about the willingness to see each other with fresh eyes, rather than through the distorted lens of hurt and disappointment that had gradually replaced the love-struck vision that had once made every ordinary moment feel touched by magic. Tuesday morning arrived with a tentative quality, like the first day of spring, when winter hasn't quite decided to release its grip, but warmth hints at possibilities that have been dormant under snow and ice for too long. When you found yourself standing in front of your closet, trying to choose clothes for a coffee date with your own wife, a phrase that would have seemed absurd 6 months ago, but now carried the strange mixture of familiarity and foreignness that characterized everything about this unexpected attempt to resurrect what you had both declared dead beyond hope of revival. Sarah had agreed to meet at the small cafe downtown, where you had shared countless conversations during the early years of your marriage, back when you would steal away for weekend mornings that stretched into afternoon, talking about books and dreams and the small observations about life that seemed profound when filtered through the alchemy of new love. The choice of location had been deliberate, a conscious decision to surround yourselves with the echoes of who you had been before. Responsibilities and routine, and the gradual accumulation of minor conflicts had slowly transformed two people who had once finished each other's sentences into strangers who struggled to communicate their most basic needs and desires. When you arrived, she was already there, sitting at a corner table with her hands wrapped around a ceramic mug, looking out the window with an expression you remembered from those long ago mornings when she would watch people pass on the sidewalk and invent stories about their lives, her imagination spinning narratives of romance and adventure that made ordinary Tuesday mornings feel like the setting for epic love stories. She looked older, of course. 6 months of separation and legal proceedings had left their mark in the subtle lines around her eyes and the way she held her shoulders as if braced against disappointment. But she also looked like herself in a way that made your chest tighten with recognition and loss, and the painful hope that maybe, just maybe, the person you had fallen in love with was still there beneath the layers of hurt and protective distance. "I wasn't sure you would come," you said as you sat down across from her, the words emerging more honestly than you had intended, revealing the vulnerability that lived just beneath your carefully constructed confidence. In this 7-day plan that had seemed inspired on Monday, but felt increasingly fragile in the bright light of Tuesday morning reality. She smiled then, the first genuine smile you had seen from her in longer than you could remember, and for a moment the years collapsed, and you were simply two people who had once chosen each other out of all the possible choices in the world, who had stood before friends and family and promised to love each other through whatever challenges life might present, who had believed with the absolute certainty of young hearts that their love was strong enough to weather any storm that might threaten their happiness. "I wasn't sure either," she admitted, her fingers tracing patterns on the table surface that had witnessed so many of your conversations when communication flowed as naturally as breathing, when understanding each other required no effort because you spoke a language composed of shared references and inside jokes, and the subtle telepathy that develops between two people who pay attention to each other's rhythms and moods, and the thousand small ways that love expresses itself in daily life. Wednesday unfolded like a carefully tended garden where flowers that had been dormant through a harsh winter began to show the first tentative signs of new growth. When you and Sarah decided to spend the afternoon walking through the park where you had proposed 24 years earlier, retracing steps that had once led toward a future you had imagined together, but had somehow lost along the way through the accumulated weight of mortgage payments and career pressures and the subtle erosions that happen when two people stop paying attention to the tender shoots of intimacy that require daily watering to survive and flourish. The conversation came easier than it had in years, flowing with the natural rhythm of two people who had once known each other's thoughts and feelings with intuitive precision, who had shared not just a bed and a bank account, but a way of seeing the world that made them feel like co-conspirators in the grand adventure of building a life together. You talked about things you hadn't discussed in months, books you had been reading, thoughts that occurred during solitary evening walks, dreams that had been shelved during the practical business of marriage, but had never quite died, observations about the changing seasons and the way light fell through autumn leaves that somehow seemed more beautiful when filtered through the consciousness of someone who understood your particular way of noticing such things. But more importantly, you began to talk about the silence that had grown between you, like a wall built one brick at a time through accumulated disappointments and misunderstandings, and the gradual process of two people learning to protect themselves from each other rather than remaining vulnerable and open to the daily risks that real intimacy required. Sarah spoke about feeling invisible in her own home, about conversations that had become practical exchanges of information rather than genuine sharing of inner lives, about the loneliness that had developed even when you were sitting in the same room, both present in body but absent in the ways that mattered most. You found yourself admitting to patterns you had been unwilling to acknowledge during months of couples therapy and mediation sessions, ways you had withdrawn when conflicts arose instead of staying engaged and working through difficulties, how you had allowed work and other distractions to provide convenient escapes from the emotional work that marriage required, how you had gradually stopped seeing Sarah as a person with her own needs and dreams, and had begun relating to her primarily as a source of either comfort or frustration, depending on whether she was supporting or challenging your own desires and priorities. The honesty was painful, but also liberating, like lancing a wound that had been festering beneath the surface, allowing infection to drain so that healing could finally begin. As the afternoon light began to fade, and you walked back toward the parking area where your separate cars waited like symbols of the divided life you had been learning to accept as permanent, Sarah stopped suddenly and turned to face you, her eyes bright with tears that seemed to contain equal measures of sadness and hope. "I had forgotten," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "how it felt to be seen by you, really seen, not just noticed or managed or accommodated, but seen for who I actually am, rather than who you needed me to be to make your life work more smoothly." Thursday arrived with a quality of light that photographers call golden hour, when ordinary objects become beautiful, not because they have changed, but because they are illuminated differently. When you and Sarah made the decision that would have seemed impossible even 3 days earlier, to spend the evening cooking dinner together in the kitchen where you had shared thousands of meals during the years when your marriage felt like a reliable source of nourishment for both body and soul, before routines had replaced rituals and efficiency had crowded out the unhurried pleasure of creating something together with your hands. The grocery shopping had been an adventure in rediscovery, wandering through familiar aisles while discussing what to prepare for this meal that carried more symbolic weight than any dinner you had shared in years. Each ingredient selected not just for its practical contribution to nutrition, but for its role in creating an experience that might help you remember what you had loved about the simple domestic pleasures that had once felt like the foundation of your shared happiness. Sarah suggested the pasta dish you had perfected during your first year of marriage when money was tight, but time seemed unlimited. when you would spend entire Saturday afternoons experimenting with recipes and talking about everything and nothing, while the kitchen filled with the scents of garlic and herbs and the indefinable aroma of contentment. As you worked side by side, chopping vegetables and stirring sauces, and moving around each other in the dance of two people who had once known each other's rhythms so well that they could share space without collision or awkwardness, something shifted in the atmosphere of your home that had felt like a museum of dead relationships for so many months. The kitchen began to feel alive again, warmed not just by the heat from the stove, but by the presence of two people who were choosing to be fully present with each other, paying attention to the small pleasures of collaboration and the way that creating something together could generate intimacy more effectively than hours of conversation or therapy sessions. You found yourselves laughing at small mistakes and inside jokes that had accumulated over decades of shared experience, references that would have meant nothing to anyone else, but carried layers of meaning between two people who had witnessed each other's evolution through all the stages of adult life, who had been present for each other's triumphs and failures, and the mundane moments that compose the majority of any long relationship. Sarah told you about the dreams that had been visiting her sleep during the months of separation, dreams where you were still married, but somehow different, more attentive, more present, as if the distance had allowed her to remember who you were before the accumulated weight of routine and stress had obscured your essential character. When dinner was ready and you sat across from each other at the table where you had shared so many meals that the experience had become automatic rather than conscious, you made a deliberate choice to eat slowly, to pay attention to flavors and textures, and the simple pleasure of nourishing your bodies with food you had prepared together. The conversation meandered through memories and current observations and tentative explorations of what might be possible if you could sustain this quality of attention and care beyond the artificial boundary of your 7-day experiment in reconnection. "This feels like coming home," Sarah said as you were clearing the dishes, her words carrying the weight of recognition and hope and the dangerous possibility that home might not be a place, but a quality of presence that two people could create together when they remembered how to see each other clearly. Friday morning dawned with the kind of clarity that follows storms, when the air feels washed clean and everything appears more vivid and defined than it had seemed before the turbulence cleared away debris and revealed the essential landscape that had been obscured by accumulated dust and confusion. When you woke to find a text message from Sarah suggesting something that would have been unthinkable a week earlier, spending the day doing absolutely nothing together, just being present in the same space without agenda or plan or the pressure to accomplish anything beyond the simple miracle of two people choosing to exist in harmony rather than conflict. She arrived at mid-morning with coffee and pastries from the bakery where you had established a Saturday tradition during the early years of your marriage, back when weekends felt like small vacations from the demands of building careers and adult lives, when time seemed expandable and the future stretched ahead like an endless summer where anything was possible if you faced it together. The sight of her standing on your doorstep with offerings of caffeine and sweetness felt like a benediction, a gesture that acknowledged the sacredness of ordinary moments when they are shared with someone who understands your particular way of moving through the world. You spent the morning reading in the living room, each absorbed in separate books, but sharing the same air, the same light filtering through windows that had witnessed so many of your quiet hours together, when physical proximity, without constant interaction, had felt like one of marriage's most underrated pleasures. Occasionally, one of you would read a passage aloud, not because it was profound or particularly relevant, but simply because sharing interesting thoughts felt as natural as breathing when you were comfortable enough with each other to trust that attention could flow back and forth without keeping careful accounts of who was giving more or receiving less. The afternoon brought a gentle rain that provided soundtrack for conversations that ranged from practical observations about home repair and garden maintenance to deeper explorations of what you had learned about yourselves during the months of separation, how living alone had revealed aspects of your personalities and preferences that had been merged or compromised during decades of accommodation and mutual adjustment. Sarah spoke about rediscovering her love of painting, how the quiet hours in her small apartment had allowed her to reconnect with creative impulses that had been dormant since the early years of your marriage, when financial pressures and career demands had gradually crowded out activities that fed her soul but didn't contribute to practical necessity. You found yourself describing the unexpected peace you had found in solitude, how learning to cook for one and entertain yourself had revealed a capacity for contentment that didn't depend on external validation or constant stimulation, how the absence of partnership had paradoxically taught you things about yourself that might actually make you a better partner if you could sustain the self-awareness and emotional honesty that solitude had cultivated. The conversation felt like archaeology, carefully excavating layers of assumption and habit to rediscover the people you had been before you became a couple and started defining yourselves primarily in relation to each other rather than as individuals who happened to choose shared life. As evening approached and the rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows, you found yourselves sitting closer together on the couch, not quite touching, but sharing warmth and the kind of comfortable silence that had once been one of your marriage's greatest treasures, when you could be fully present with each other without needing to fill every moment with words or activity. Saturday arrived like a gift, wrapped in morning mist and the promise of possibility, when you and Sarah made the decision that surprised you both with its naturalness to spend the day revisiting places that had been important in your shared history, not as a sentimental journey through a museum of dead romance, but as an active exploration of whether the people you had become could still find meaning and connection in the locations where your younger selves had written the first chapters of your love story together. The drive to the lake, where you had spent your honeymoon, felt both familiar and strange, like returning to a childhood home after decades away to discover that it was simultaneously exactly as you remembered and completely transformed by the passage of time and your own evolution. Sarah sat in the passenger seat of your car, the first time in over a year that you had traveled anywhere together, and the intimacy of shared space and forward motion toward a common destination felt like a small miracle after months of moving in opposite directions through separate lives that had once been unified by shared goals and dreams. When you reached the lakeside cabin, where you had spent a week learning to be married, learning to navigate the tender territory between intense romance and daily companionship, learning to create private rituals and inside jokes that would serve as the foundation for a language that only the two of you would ever fully understand. You sat for a moment in the car, looking at the unchanged facade of a building that had housed such transformative experiences. "Are you ready for this?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying equal measures of excitement and trepidation, the recognition that returning to sites of former happiness could either heal old wounds or make them ache with renewed intensity. The afternoon unfolded like a gentle excavation of buried treasure, each familiar landmark triggering cascades of memory that revealed how much of your shared history had been archived rather than lost, temporarily inaccessible, but not destroyed by the conflicts and disappointments that had driven you apart. You walked the trail around the lake where you had taken evening strolls while planning your future together, when the challenges of marriage seemed theoretical rather than lived experience, when love felt like an inexhaustible resource that would sustain you through any difficulty that life might present. But more importantly, you discovered that you could create new memories in these same locations, that the people you had become through years of growth and struggle, and the hard-won wisdom that comes from surviving disappointment and failure, could still find joy and connection in simple pleasures like skipping stones across water and sharing observations about the changing colors of autumn leaves reflected in the lake's surface. Sarah spoke about how the months of separation had taught her to distinguish between the parts of her identity that had been genuinely shared with you and the parts that had been subsumed or compromised in service of maintaining harmony in a relationship that had gradually become more about accommodation than authentic connection. She had rediscovered aspects of her personality that marriage had not eliminated, but had somehow covered over, interests and opinions and ways of being that she was learning to honor again without feeling disloyal to the commitment she had made to building a life with another person. As the sun began to set over the lake, painting the sky in colors that seemed designed specifically to remind couples why they had fallen in love, you found yourselves holding hands for the first time in over a year, not as a dramatic gesture of reconciliation, but as a natural expression of the affection and care that had never actually died, but had been buried under accumulated resentment and defensive distance. Sunday morning brought with it the weight of ending and beginning, the recognition that this was the final day of your 7-day experiment in resurrection, when you would need to decide whether the tenderness and understanding and renewed affection you had discovered together was substantial enough to support the architecture of rebuilt marriage, or whether it was simply a beautiful epilogue to a love story that had reached its natural conclusion, despite your best efforts to extend its lifespan through intention and hope and the willingness to see each other with fresh eyes. Sarah arrived early, before you had finished your first cup of coffee, carrying a small overnight bag that suggested she had been thinking about possibilities that neither of you had voiced, but both had been contemplating, as this week of rediscovery had revealed that the connection between you was not dead, but dormant, not destroyed, but temporarily obscured by patterns of interaction that had gradually replaced intimacy with routine and affection with efficient coexistence. "I've been thinking," she said, as she set down her bag and accepted the coffee you offered with hands that trembled slightly with the vulnerability of someone preparing to risk everything on the chance that love could indeed be resurrected. If two people were willing to do the careful work of rebuilding trust and communication and the daily practices that sustain intimacy over decades of changing circumstances and personal evolution, about what it would mean to really try again, not just for 7 days, but for the rest of our lives, about whether we've learned enough about ourselves and each other to create something better than what we had before. The conversation that followed was unlike any you had shared during your marriage, characterized by the kind of radical honesty that is only possible when two people have already lost everything and therefore have nothing left to protect through careful editing or diplomatic omission. You spoke about the specific behaviors and patterns that had created distance between you, not to assign blame or relitigate old grievances, but to understand what would need to change if you were going to build a new relationship rather than simply resuming the old one that had proved unsustainable despite your good intentions and genuine care for each other. Sarah talked about her need for independence and individual identity within marriage, how she had gradually lost herself in the role of wife and partner and needed to rediscover ways of being in relationship that honored both connection and autonomy, both shared goals and individual dreams. You found yourself acknowledging your tendency to withdraw when conflicts arose, how you had used work and other distractions as escape hatches from the emotional labor that marriage required, how you needed to learn to stay present and engaged even when conversations became difficult or uncomfortable. But more importantly, you both recognized that the love you had discovered during this week was not the same love you had shared in your 20s, when passion and romance had seemed like enough to sustain any commitment, when you had believed that feeling loved was the same thing as being loved, and that emotional intensity could substitute for the practical skills of daily kindness and consistent attention to each other's changing needs and desires. This new love felt more sustainable precisely because it was based on choice rather than compulsion, on conscious decision rather than automatic response, on the mature understanding that marriage was not a destination you reached and then inhabited passively, but a practice you engaged in daily through hundreds of small decisions to prioritize each other's well-being and growth, even when it required a sacrifice or discomfort or the courage to remain vulnerable in the face of uncertainty. As Sunday evening approached, and you realized that tomorrow would bring either a phone call to your lawyers, canceling the final divorce proceedings, or a heartbreaking return to the process of legally dissolving what you had spent 7 days discovering might still be worth saving, you and Sarah found yourselves sitting in the backyard where you had planted your first garden together, where you had learned that growing things required patience and consistent care, and the faith that seeds planted in darkness would eventually find their way toward light if given proper attention and nourishment. The garden had been neglected during the months of separation, weeds growing wild among the perennials you had once tended together, but the basic structure remained intact, the bones of what you had created together still visible beneath the overgrowth that could be cleared away with effort and intention. It seemed like an apt metaphor for your marriage, not dead, but dormant, not destroyed, but requiring careful attention and the willingness to clear away what was no longer serving growth in order to make space for new possibilities to emerge. "I want to try," Sarah said, as the sun began to set behind the oak tree you had planted to commemorate your 10th anniversary, her words carrying the weight of decision and hope, and the recognition that choosing love was not a one-time commitment, but a daily practice that would require ongoing courage and creativity and the willingness to forgive each other's failures while celebrating small successes in the project of learning to love each other well across decades of change and challenge. I want to try too, you replied, surprised by how much relief those words brought, how much tension you had been carrying without realizing it, how much energy had been devoted to protecting yourself from disappointment when what you really wanted was to trust that love could indeed be stronger than fear if two people were willing to do the work of building relationship that honored both individual growth and shared commitment. The decision felt both enormous and simple, like choosing to plant new seeds in soil that had supported growth before and could do so again if properly prepared and tended. You talked about practical arrangements, Sarah moving back home, establishing new patterns of communication and conflict resolution, creating structures that would support the changes you both wanted to make rather than defaulting to old habits that had gradually eroded the foundation of trust and affection that marriage required. But you also talked about the deeper commitments this choice represented, the agreement to see each other generously rather than defensively, to assume good intentions even when actions caused hurt or disappointment, to remain curious about each other's inner lives rather than making assumptions based on past patterns, to celebrate the ways you were both continuing to grow and evolve rather than trying to freeze each other in familiar roles that might feel safe but ultimately constrained the fullness of who you were becoming. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared in the clear October sky, you found yourselves lying on the grass looking up at the vast expanse of space that put your small human dramas in perspective, while somehow making them feel more precious rather than less significant, understanding that choosing love in a universe characterized by entropy and impermanence was both futile and magnificent, both impossible and the only thing that ultimately mattered. 1 month later, when Sarah had moved back home and you were both learning to navigate the delicate territory of rebuilding a marriage that was simultaneously familiar and completely new, when you had discovered that love could indeed be resurrected, but that resurrection required ongoing attention and care rather than being a one-time miracle that guaranteed future happiness, you found yourselves sitting at your kitchen table on a Tuesday evening, sharing dinner and conversation that flowed with the ease of people who had learned to be genuinely curious about each other's inner lives rather than assuming they already knew everything worth knowing. The transition had not been seamless or without challenges. Old patterns had reasserted themselves occasionally, requiring conscious effort and gentle correction to maintain the new ways of relating you had discovered during your 7-day courtship of your own marriage. But the difficulties felt manageable rather than overwhelming because you were facing them together with shared commitment to growth and change, rather than as adversaries protecting separate interests and competing visions of what relationship should provide. Sarah had returned to painting with renewed enthusiasm, transforming the spare bedroom into a studio where she could pursue the creative work that had been dormant during the years when marriage had gradually consumed more and more of her identity until she had forgotten who she was, apart from being wife and partner. Watching her rediscover this part of herself had been one of the unexpected gifts of your reconciliation, learning that love could be expressed not just through merger and shared activities, but through supporting each other's individual growth and celebrating the ways that personal fulfillment could enhance rather than threaten partnership when both people remained committed to connection alongside autonomy. You had made changes too, learning to be more present and emotionally available, developing the skill of staying engaged during difficult conversations rather than withdrawing into work or other distractions when relationship required emotional labor that felt challenging or uncomfortable. The practice of marriage, you discovered, was like learning a musical instrument, requiring daily attention and the willingness to make mistakes while gradually developing competency in creating harmony together rather than competing melodies that might sound beautiful individually but created discord when played simultaneously. The most surprising discovery was how much you enjoyed each other's company when you were both fully present and engaged, rather than simply coexisting in the same physical space while mentally occupied with separate concerns and distractions. Conversations that had once felt like obligation or conflict management had become opportunities for genuine exchange of ideas and feelings, chances to learn new things about a person you had thought you knew completely, but who revealed new depths and dimensions. When approached with curiosity rather than assumption, your friends and family had reacted to your reconciliation with mixtures of joy and skepticism, happiness that you had found your way back to each other, tempered by concern that you might be repeating patterns that had failed before rather than creating something genuinely different. But you had learned that other people's opinions, however well-intentioned, could not substitute for your own direct experience of what was working in your relationship and what needed continued attention and development. The 7 days that had begun as a desperate attempt to avoid the finality of divorce had evolved into an ongoing practice of choosing love consciously and consistently, understanding that marriage was not a problem to be solved once and then forgotten, but a creative project that required ongoing investment of time and attention and care. 6 months after your 7-day miracle had transformed despair into hope and legal proceedings into renewed commitment, when you and Sarah had settled into rhythms that felt both comfortably familiar and excitingly new, when you had learned that successful marriage was not about avoiding conflict, but about developing skills for navigating disagreement without causing lasting damage to trust and affection, when you had discovered that love could indeed grow stronger through challenge rather than being diminished by it, you found yourselves reflecting on how profoundly your understanding of relationship had evolved through the process of nearly losing each other and then choosing to rebuild with greater wisdom and intention. The work of rebuilding had been more complex than either of you had anticipated during those initial 7 days when hope and determination had felt like sufficient resources for overcoming any obstacle that might arise in the project of resurrection. You had needed to learn new communication skills, develop practices for maintaining individual identity within partnership, create structures that supported both connection and autonomy, and most challenging of all, learn to trust each other again after months of protecting yourselves from further disappointment and pain. Couples therapy had become a regular part of your routine, not because your marriage was failing, but because you had discovered that having an objective third party help you navigate difficult conversations and identify patterns that might be destructive before they became entrenched was like having a personal trainer for your relationship, supporting health and strength rather than treating disease or dysfunction. The weekly sessions had taught you that seeking help was a sign of commitment rather than failure, evidence that you valued your marriage enough to invest in developing the skills it required. Individual therapy had been equally important, helping each of you understand the personal history and psychological patterns that had contributed to the breakdown of your relationship. Learning to take responsibility for your own emotional needs and reactions rather than expecting your partner to manage or fix feelings that originated from sources that predated your marriage. Sarah had worked through childhood experiences that had made it difficult for her to maintain individual identity within relationship, while you had explored family patterns that had taught you to withdraw rather than engage when emotional situations became intense or uncomfortable. But perhaps most importantly, you had both learned that love was not a feeling that happened to you, but an action you chose to take repeatedly, daily, sometimes moment by moment, when circumstances made care and kindness more difficult, but also more necessary. The passionate romance of your early years had been replaced by something deeper and more sustainable, a committed partnership based on conscious choice rather than automatic response, on appreciation for who each other actually was, rather than projection of who you hoped the other person might become. Your friends who had watched your separation and reconciliation with interest and concern often asked what had made the difference, what had changed during those 7 days that had not been possible during years of marriage counseling and attempts to work through problems while still living together. The answer was complex, but centered around the recognition that sometimes you need to fully release something in order to choose it freely, that the willingness to lose each other had paradoxically made it possible to find each other again on new terms that honored both individual growth and shared commitment. The 7 days had provided a laboratory for experimenting with new ways of relating without the pressure of needing to make permanent decisions or the weight of years of accumulated resentment and defensive patterns. You had been able to see each other clearly because you had nothing left to lose, could be honest because the worst had already happened, could take risks because you were already facing the ultimate risk of ending everything you had built together. Most importantly, the time apart had allowed you both to rediscover who you were as individuals, to remember interests and dreams and aspects of personality that had been compromised or merged during years of accommodation and adjustment. When you came back together, you were not trying to resurrect the old relationship, but creating a new one between two people who had evolved and grown and learned to take responsibility for their own happiness rather than expecting marriage to provide everything they needed for fulfillment. 1 year after the 7 days that had saved your marriage, when you and Sarah were celebrating your wedding anniversary, not as a commemoration of past promises, but as a renewal of commitments that had been tested and deepened through the fire of near loss and conscious reconstruction, when you had learned that true intimacy was not the absence of conflict, but the presence of trust, that you could navigate disagreement without destroying love, you found yourselves planning a second honeymoon that would honor both who you had been and who you were becoming together. The past year had brought challenges that tested your rebuilt relationship: job stress, family illness, financial pressures, and the ordinary difficulties that every long-term partnership must navigate. But you had faced them with skills and perspectives that had been forged through the experience of nearly losing each other and choosing to fight for love rather than surrendering to the entropy that gradually destroys many marriages through neglect and the assumption that connection can be maintained without conscious effort and ongoing investment. You had learned to see conflict as information rather than threat, understanding that disagreements often revealed important needs or values that deserved attention rather than being problems to be solved quickly or avoided entirely. Sarah's frustration with household responsibilities had led to conversations about fairness and partnership that resulted in more equitable distribution of domestic labor. Your stress about financial planning had opened discussions about goals and priorities that helped you align your efforts toward shared objectives rather than working at cross purposes. Most importantly, you had developed the ability to repair quickly when interactions went wrong, addressing hurts and misunderstandings before they could fester into resentment or distance. The phrase, "that didn't work for me," had become part of your regular vocabulary, creating space for feedback and course correction without blame or shame, allowing both of you to learn from mistakes rather than defending against acknowledgement of imperfection. Your physical intimacy had also been transformed through the process of rebuilding emotional connection and trust. The passion you rediscovered was not the automatic attraction of new romance, but the deeper eroticism that emerges when two people truly know and appreciate each other. When sexual connection grows from genuine affection and admiration, rather than being expected to create or sustain love in the absence of other forms of intimacy, friends and family members had stopped asking whether you thought your reconciliation would last, recognizing that you had both changed in fundamental ways that made your relationship more stable and satisfying than it had been even during the early years, when passion had seemed like sufficient foundation for lifelong commitment. They could see in your interactions the evidence of two people who had learned to love each other skillfully rather than just intensely. The most profound change was in your understanding of what marriage could be when approached as a creative practice rather than a static institution, when viewed as an ongoing opportunity for growth and discovery rather than a contract that defined fixed roles and responsibilities. You had created something unique together, a partnership that honored both tradition and innovation, both security and adventure, both individual fulfillment and shared purpose. As you planned your anniversary celebration, you chose to return to the lake where you had spent your original honeymoon and where you had made the decision to fight for your marriage during those crucial 7 days. But this time, you were going not as young people, full of hopes and dreams, but as mature partners who had learned to create love consciously through daily choices and the willingness to keep choosing each other through all the changes that time would bring. 2 years after the 7 days that had become the turning point in your marriage story, when you and Sarah had fully integrated the lessons of separation and reunion into a way of being together that felt both sustainable and continuing to evolve, when friends would ask for advice about their own struggling relationships, and you would always begin by emphasizing that there was no formula or technique that could substitute for the willingness of both people to do the difficult work of seeing each other clearly and choosing love consciously, even when it would be easier to give up. You found yourselves mentoring other couples who were facing the kinds of challenges that had once threatened to destroy your own marriage. The work you did with other couples was not formal counseling but the kind of witnessing and encouragement that comes from people who have walked through the valley of relationship death and emerged with hard-won wisdom about what was required to build marriages that could withstand the pressures and changes that inevitably came with time. You would share your story not as a success formula that others should copy, but as evidence that love could indeed be resurrected if both people were willing to examine their own contributions to relationship breakdown and commit to developing new skills and patterns of interaction. The most important insight you shared was that the 7 days had not been magical in themselves, but had created conditions where you could see each other without the distortion of accumulated resentment and defensive positioning, where you could remember what you had loved about each other before problems had dominated your attention, where you could imagine a future together that was based on who you were becoming rather than who you had been during the most difficult periods of your marriage. Many couples, you discovered, were so focused on fixing what was wrong that they had forgotten what had been right, so committed to addressing problems that they had stopped nurturing the positive aspects of their relationship that had drawn them together in the first place. The work of rebuilding often required a temporary suspension of problem solving in favor of simply enjoying each other's company and remembering why they had chosen partnership in the first place. But you also emphasize that reconciliation was not always possible or advisable, that some relationships had been too damaged by betrayal or abuse or fundamental incompatibility to be safely or successfully rebuilt, that the willingness to fight for love needed to be balanced with wisdom about when fighting was no longer serving anyone's highest good. Your 7 days had worked because you had both been genuinely committed to change and growth, because the problems in your marriage had been about patterns and communication rather than character defects or values, conflicts that could not be resolved. The couples you worked with who found their way back to each other shared certain characteristics: genuine care for each other's well-being, even in the midst of conflict, willingness to take responsibility for their own contributions to problems rather than focusing primarily on their partner's failures, ability to remember what they had valued about their relationship before difficulties overshadowed positive aspects, and most importantly, commitment to doing whatever personal work was necessary to show up differently in relationship rather than expecting change to come only from their partner. Sarah had returned to school to become a licensed marriage and family therapist. Her own experience of relationship breakdown and recovery, having revealed a calling to help others navigate similar challenges with greater skill and support than she had initially received. Watching her develop professionally while maintaining our personal relationship had taught you that individual growth and partnership could indeed support each other when both people remained committed to both personal development and shared goals. And so, we reach the gentle conclusion of this story of love lost and found, this meditation on second chances and the possibility that relationships which seem irreparably broken can sometimes be healed when two people are willing to release their grip on old patterns and create something entirely new together. When they learn that love is not a feeling that happens to them, but a practice they engage in daily through thousands of small choices to prioritize each other's well-being and growth. 5 years after those 7 days that had transformed despair into hope and legal proceedings into renewed commitment, You and Sarah had built a marriage that was stronger and more satisfying than anything you had shared during your first attempt at lifelong partnership. The relationship that had been resurrected was not the same as what had died. It was deeper, more conscious, more skillfully crafted, based on mature understanding of what sustainable love required, rather than the romantic assumptions that had carried you through your early years together. The most beautiful aspect of your journey was the recognition that the crisis that had nearly destroyed your marriage had ultimately been the catalyst for creating something better than what you had lost. The pain of separation had been necessary for breaking old patterns that were no longer serving your growth, creating space for new ways of loving that honored both individual authenticity and shared commitment, both personal dreams and partnership goals. Your story had become a source of hope for other couples facing seemingly insurmountable challenges, evidence that love could indeed triumph over fear and hurt and the accumulated debris of years of misunderstanding and missed connection when two people were willing to approach each other with fresh eyes and open hearts. But you always emphasized that your 7 days had been successful, not because of any particular techniques or strategies, but because you had both been genuinely ready to take responsibility for change, rather than waiting for your partner to become different. As we drift toward sleep, carrying this vision of love renewed and marriage transformed through conscious choice and daily practice, we might remember that every relationship, whether romantic or friendship or family connection, offers ongoing opportunities for resurrection and renewal when we are willing to see each other generously and choose connection over self-protection, curiosity over assumption, appreciation over criticism. Perhaps in your dreams tonight, you will experience what it feels like to be seen clearly and loved fully by someone who knows your flaws and weaknesses, but chooses to focus on your potential and beauty. Someone who is committed to growing alongside you rather than trying to change you into who they think you should become. Perhaps you will wake tomorrow with renewed appreciation for the people in your life who love you well, with greater willingness to offer the kind of generous attention and patient understanding that allows relationships to flourish rather than merely survive, with deeper understanding that love is both the most natural thing in the world and a skill that requires ongoing development and practice. And perhaps, in carrying that understanding into your daily interactions, you will become one of the love builders, one of the second chance creators, one of those who help demonstrate that no relationship is beyond hope when two people are willing to do the sacred work of learning to love each other with increasing skill and devotion across all the seasons of their shared life. The 7 days continue in every moment when someone chooses love over fear, connection over distance, forgiveness over resentment, hope over despair. Perhaps tonight, as you close your eyes, you'll dream of love that refuses to give up, of marriages that find their way back to each other through the patient work of seeing clearly and choosing kindly. Perhaps you'll wake knowing that every relationship holds the possibility of renewal when two hearts commit to the daily practice of love. Sweet dreams, hopeful heart. Like if you believe love can be rebuilt, subscribe for more healing stories.